Ever wondered what happens when justice is pushed to its limit? When executions become spectacles of pain and controversy, there could be more to the crime than meets the eye. From Doyle Lee Ham's failed execution attempt that left him bleeding for hours to Smith's long, agonizing final moments, these are the most controversial death row executions in U.S. history. Brace yourself, because these stories will stay with you long after the video ends. John Wayne Gacy, State, Illinois. Date of execution, May 10, 1994. Gacy was a serial killer who tortured and murdered at least 33 young men and boys in Norwood Park Township, Illinois. He was commonly known as the Killer Clown. Gacy was arrested on December 21, 1978. On March 13, 1980, Gacy was sentenced to death. His execution was scheduled for May 10, 1994. On the morning of May 9, 1994, authorities transferred Gacy to Stateville Correctional Center to be executed. That afternoon, he had a private picnic on the prison grounds with his family. In the hours before the execution, over 1,000 people gathered outside the prison. Most supported the execution, but a small group of anti-death penalty protesters were also present. Some supporters wore T-shirts referencing Gacy's past work as a clown, with slogans like "No Tears for the Clown." At 12:40 a.m., officials began administering the lethal injection. The chemicals unexpectedly solidified and clogged the IV tube. The execution team replaced the clogged tube, and the execution continued. The entire process took 18 minutes. Anesthesiologists blamed the problem on the prison officials' inexperience. This error led Illinois to adopt a new method of lethal injection. William Kunkel, a prosecutor from Gacy's trial, said, "He got a much easier death than any of his victims." Reports say Gacy was diagnosed as a psychopath and showed no remorse for his crimes. Before his execution, he told his lawyer that killing him would not make up for the victim's losses and said the state was murdering him. After officials confirmed Gacy's death at 12:58 a.m. on May 10, 1994, they removed his brain. Helen Morrison, who testified at Gacy's trial and interviewed him and other serial killers, keeps the brain. She studies common traits of violent sociopaths. Gacy was cremated, but the location of his ashes remains unknown. Angel Diaz, State, Florida. Date of execution, December 12, 2006. Diaz was charged with the 1983 killing of Joseph Nagy, manager of the Velvet Sing Lounge in Little Gables, Florida. Diaz's girlfriend at the time told police that Diaz was involved. Police found Diaz's fingerprint on a matchbook left at the scene. In 1986, a jury found Diaz guilty of first-degree murder. During his trial, he threatened witnesses, fired his lawyer, and chose to represent himself. Diaz claimed that his accomplice had committed the murder. The jury sentenced him to death by a vote of 8-4. The testimony of a fellow inmate from Dade County, Ralph Gajus, played a key role in Diaz's conviction and sentence. In 1984, he testified that Diaz had confessed in his cell that he shot Nagy. Although Diaz spoke little English and Gajus knew no Spanish, they used hand signals to communicate. Diaz's conviction largely depended on Gajus's testimony. In 2006, the court denied Diaz's last appeal. On November 28, 2006, the governor of Puerto Rico, Aníbal Acevedo Vilá, asked the governor of Florida, Jeb Bush, to grant clemency. Governor Vilá raised concerns about the fairness of Diaz's trial and Gajus's recanted testimony. On December 13, 2006, officials executed Diaz by lethal injection at the Florida State Prison near Rayford. The execution caused major controversy. Unlike usual procedures, Diaz needed an extra dose of drugs. The entire process took about 34 minutes instead of the usual 7.5 minutes. His family called it a botched execution. Gretel Plessinger, spokeswoman for the Florida Department of Corrections, said Diaz felt no pain and blamed a liver condition for the delay, but the family denied that he had any such condition. A later investigation found that the execution team placed the needles incorrectly. The needle passed through the vein and delivered the drugs into soft tissue instead of directly into the bloodstream. This mistake delayed the drugs from reaching the brain and diaphragm, which greatly extended the time before death. As a result, Governor Jeb Bush postponed all pending executions. However, on July 18, 2007, the new governor, Charlie Crist, ended the ban by signing a death warrant to execute Mark Dean Schwab. In 2014, the New Republic published photos of the botched execution. The images showed discoloration on Diaz's arms. Rommel Broom, State, Ohio, died December 28, 2020. Broom was found guilty of aggravated murder in 1985 in connection with the and death of 14-year-old Trina Middleton. During his execution, a medical team failed to find a usable vein for a lethal injection after at least 18 attempts. So former Governor Ted Strickland granted Broom an emergency reprieve. Broom's legal team appealed to stop the state from trying to execute him again. The case moved through the state court system until the court denied it. Justice Judith Ann Lanzinger wrote in the majority opinion, because Broom's life was never at risk since the drugs were not introduced, and because the state is committed to carrying out executions in a constitutional manner, we do not believe that it would shock the public's conscience to allow the state to carry out Broom's execution. Broom's lawyers, Timothy F. Sweeney and S. Adele Shank, expressed disappointment with the divided decision. Mr. Broom has been informed of the decision and remains in good spirits, the statement said. He looks forward to pursuing the additional legal remedies available to him. In their appeal, Broom's legal team argued that, by virtue of the 2 hours of painful efforts to insert needles into his body, he had already been punished. They claimed a second execution attempt would violate double jeopardy protections, which prevent multiple punishments for the same crime. The Supreme Court disagreed. The justices said the failed execution did not count as completed punishment. Justice Lanzinger wrote, "The execution commences when the lethal drug enters the IV line. In this case, because the attempt did not proceed to the point of injection of a lethal drug into the IV line, jeopardy was never attached." Broom's lawyers also argued that a second execution attempt would be cruel and unusual punishment. A majority of the court rejected that claim. Lanzinger wrote, "The state's intention in carrying out the execution is not to cause unnecessary physical pain or psychological harm, and the pain and emotional trauma Broom already experienced do not equate with the type of torture prohibited by the Eighth Amendment." On December 12, 2016, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear Broom's appeal. On May 19, 2017, the Ohio Supreme Court scheduled Broom's execution for June 17, 2020. On April 14, 2020, the court delayed the execution to March 16, 2022. On December 28, 2020, Broom died from suspected COVID-19 complications at Franklin Medical Center in Columbus, Ohio. Dennis McGuire, State, Ohio. Date of execution, January 16, 2014. McGuire was sentenced to death on December 8, 1994 for the murder of Joy Stewart in 1989. Stewart disappeared on February 11, 1989. 2 hikers found her body the next day in the woods near Bantus Creek in West Alexandria, Ohio. An autopsy showed that she had died from having her throat slashed with a knife after being mistreated. McGuire spent more than 19 years on death row before his execution. In September 2013, Ohio ran out of the drug pentobarbital. This drug, made in Denmark, had strict export rules that stopped it from being sold to U.S. correction departments. European manufacturers also banned U.S. prisons from using their drugs for executions. Because of this, Ohio had to use a new drug combination to execute McGuire. The state chose midazolam, a sedative, and hydromorphone, an opioid painkiller. This drug mix had never been tested before. McGuire's lawyers warned that the new drugs might cause him to suffer from air hunger, which would make him suffocate. In court, an Ohio prosecutor said McGuire was not automatically guaranteed a painless execution. A judge allowed the execution to proceed. On January 16, 2014, 10:27 a.m., officials injected McGuire with both drugs. A witness said that 4 minutes into the process, McGuire struggled and gasped loudly for air. He made snorting and choking sounds that lasted for at least 10 to 15 minutes. At 10:53 a.m., officials pronounced McGuire dead. The execution took more than 26 minutes, though it should have taken around 8 minutes. This was the longest execution ever recorded in Ohio. During the execution, McGuire's stomach reportedly swelled unusually, similar to a hernia. Witnesses said he clenched his fists, struggled, and gasped loudly for air. After the execution, McGuire's family planned to sue Ohio for cruel and unusual punishment, which they said violated the U.S. Constitution. A professor of anesthesia at Harvard Medical School told an Ohio court that using midazolam was wrong for executions. He said the state risked McGuire being awake for up to 5 minutes while suffocating. The human rights group Reprieve also issued a statement. They said they were shocked that Ohio went ahead with the execution despite expert warnings. Ohio put all pending executions on hold. Governor John Kasich declared an unofficial moratorium on capital punishment. The state tried to find compounded or specially mixed lethal drugs, but failed. More than a year later, McGuire's family dropped their civil rights lawsuit. The Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction announced it would stop using the execution method used on McGuire and switch to a different anesthetic. This decision satisfied McGuire's family. Kasich ruled out other execution methods like hanging or firing squads. It took over 3 years before Ohio planned to resume executions. They chose a new 3-drug combination: midazolam, rocuronium bromide, and potassium chloride. Clayton Lockett, State, Oklahoma. Date of execution: April 29, 2014. Lockett was convicted in 2000 of murder and kidnapping. In June 1999, Lockett kidnapped and shot Stephanie Neiman. He shot her after she threatened to go to the police as soon as she was released. The shot wasn't fatal. However, Clayton said he wasn't going to shoot her again. Instead, he ordered an accomplice to bury her alive. Neiman died from the wounds. Lockett refused to cooperate with the execution. Staff had to taser him. Plus, he also tried to cut himself earlier that day. A paramedic tried twice to insert an IV needle into Lockett's left arm but failed. She then tried the brachial vein in his biceps but failed again. She asked Dr. Johnny Zellmer for help. He tried 3 times to put the IV into the jugular vein in Lockett's neck but failed. He then tried the subclavian vein near Lockett's collarbone but failed again. The paramedic tried 2 veins in Lockett's left foot but failed. Finally, Zellmer inserted the needle into the femoral vein in Lockett's groin. The execution started at 6:23 p.m. Central Daylight Time when staff gave Lockett the first drug, midazolam, a sedative. At 6:33 p.m., after Lockett was declared unconscious, they injected the next 2 drugs, vecuronium bromide, a paralytic, and potassium chloride, which stops the heart. At 6:36 p.m., 3 minutes after being declared unconscious, Lockett started to struggle violently. He raised his head and spoke, saying, "Oh man, I'm not." And according to some sources, something's wrong. At 6:37 p.m., he tried to get up from the table and loudly exhaled. A lawyer for Lockett said it looked like torture. Robert Patton, director of the Oklahoma Department of Corrections, said a doctor stopped the execution when it became clear that Lockett had a vein failure. Patton called off the execution at 6:56 p.m. Lockett was declared dead at 7:06 p.m. from a heart attack. The paramedics said they did not perform any life-saving measures. A later investigation found that staff had properly administered all 3 drugs to Lockett. However, a cloth placed over Lockett's groin to block witnesses from seeing the area stopped staff from noticing that the IV connection in his groin had failed due to a collapsed vein. After an attending doctor said Lockett had not received enough drugs to cause death, and there were not enough drugs left to continue, officials halted the execution after 33 minutes. Prison officials reportedly talked about taking Lockett to a hospital before he died from a heart attack. Patton stated the chemicals did not enter into the offender. The report noted the doctor checked the IV and reported the blood vein had collapsed, and the drugs had either absorbed into tissue, leaked out, or both. Patton asked if enough drugs had been administered to cause death, to which the doctor replied, no. The director then asked if another vein was available to complete the execution, and if so, were there enough drugs left? The doctor answered no to both questions. According to the Department of Corrections, it took 6 to 12 minutes to pronounce an inmate dead in the previous 19 executions before Lockett. Lockett's execution took 43 minutes. After Lockett's death, Governor Mary Fallin of Oklahoma requested a review of the execution process. Dean Sanderford, Lockett's lawyer, witnessed the execution. He expressed concern that the planned review would not be independent. Madeline Cohen, an attorney for Warner, criticized Lockett's execution and said, Clayton Lockett was tortured to death, also condemning the state's refusal to disclose basic information about the lethal injection drugs. Democratic State Representative Joe Dorman called for an outside investigation. The White House said the execution fell short of humane standards. President Barack Obama called the event deeply disturbing and ordered Attorney General Eric Holder to review the federal policy on executions. Media outlets described the execution as botched. The Telegraph called it barbarism and inappropriate in a civilized society, adding that the idea of actually spectating while the victim is killed surely clashes with basic humanity. Richard Dieter, executive director of the Death Penalty Information Center, called the execution a torturous action and said it might lead to a halt in executions until states can prove they can do it without problems. He added that even death penalty supporters should be concerned about whether the state knows what it is doing. Lockett's legal team released preliminary results of an independent autopsy. Forensic pathologist Joseph Cohen conducted the autopsy. He found that the execution team failed to make sure the IV was properly inserted. According to Cohen, staff made several attempts to insert IVs in Lockett's arms and groin before using the femoral vein, but they failed to ensure the IV was fully in place, which caused the drugs to be absorbed into his muscle. Cohen also rejected the state's claim that Lockett's veins failed, saying his veins were healthy. Joseph Rudolph Wood III, State, Arizona, date of execution, July 23, 2014. Wood was convicted of murder and assault after shooting his estranged girlfriend and her father. Deborah and Eugene Dietz died immediately. A court convicted Wood of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of aggravated assault against a police officer. He received the death penalty for each murder and a 15-year prison sentence for each assault charge. The sentences were set to run concurrently. Officials scheduled Wood's execution using a combination of midazolam and hydromorphone. The execution started at 1:52 p.m. Mountain Standard Time and ended at 3:49 p.m. when Wood was declared dead. Officials injected Wood with a drug mix of midazolam, a sedative, and hydromorphone, a semi-synthetic opioid. The doses given were intended to kill him with the first application of both drugs. However, Wood had to receive the drugs 15 times. During that time, he gasped and snorted for over 1 hour. A media witness said Wood's breathing looked like a fish gulping for air. One Associated Press reporter counted more than 600 gasps. Experts said the execution should have taken about 10 minutes. Witnesses speaking to ABC News said, "It seemed to go as normal. They put in the catheters. They announced they were administering the drug. He closed his eyes and went to sleep." Then one witness said, "About 11 minutes in, I noticed his lip quiver. A minute later, he gasped. Then he did it again and again. It was loud. It wasn't some nice, peaceful sleeping sound." The witnesses added, "Everybody was thinking something went wrong. You could see the looks on the faces of the people from the Department of Corrections who were standing along the side. They were looking at each other nervously." Wood's lawyers filed an emergency appeal with the Supreme Court 1 hour into the execution. They asked to stop the prolonged procedure, writing, "He has been gasping and snorting for more than an hour. He is still alive." Justice Anthony Kennedy denied the appeal. The decision came about 30 minutes after Wood's death. After the execution, Deborah Dietz's sister told the Associated Press, "What I saw today is him being executed. It is nothing compared to what happened on August 7, 1989. Jean Brown was referring to Wood's murder of her father and sister on that day. She added, "What's excruciating is seeing your father lying there in a pool of blood, seeing your sister lying in a pool of blood." Governor Jan Brewer ordered a review of the state's execution procedures. She was concerned about how long it took Wood to die. Brewer said, "One thing is certain, however, inmate Wood died in a lawful manner, and by eyewitness and medical accounts, he did not suffer. This is in stark comparison to the gruesome, vicious suffering that he inflicted on his 2 victims and the lifetime of suffering he has caused their family." Charles Ryan, director of Arizona's Department of Corrections, said in a statement, "Once the inmate was sedated, other than sonorous respiration or snoring, he did not grimace or make any further movement. Throughout this execution, I conferred and collaborated with our IV team members and was assured unequivocally that the inmate was comatose and never in pain or distress." Stephanie Grisham, then a spokeswoman for the Arizona Attorney General's office and a witness, said, "There was no gasping of air, there was snoring. He just lay there. It was quite peaceful." Dale Bache, Wood's public defender, criticized the execution as a violation of the Constitution's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. He said it could have been prevented. On July 24, 2014, Arizona temporarily stopped executions after the Wood case. They paused all executions to review their procedures. Arizona did not resume executions for 8 years. Ronald Smith, State, Alabama. Date of execution, December 8, 2016. Smith was convicted in Alabama for the 1994 death of Casey Wilson, a convenience store clerk. The U.S. Supreme Court delayed Smith's execution twice, but then allowed it to proceed. He died 34 minutes after the execution began at Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, according to reporter Kent Falk, who was present. 13 minutes near the start of the execution, Smith appeared to struggle for breath. He heaved, coughed, clenched his left fist, and his left eye sometimes stayed slightly open. These actions happened after the first of 3 drugs was given, according to the report. Alabama requires a corrections officer to check if the inmate is unconscious before giving the next 2 drugs. Officers tested Smith twice, partly by pinching him. After the first test, he heaved, coughed, and gasped. After the second test, his right arm and hand moved. Eventually, officials gave the last 2 drugs to stop Smith's breathing and heart. Bob Horton, a spokesman for the Department of Corrections, said it took 30 minutes for Smith to die, which is normal under the state's death row protocol. Horton, who watched the execution, confirmed that Smith coughed at times during the first 13 minutes but showed no signs of being conscious. Doyle Lee Ham, State, Alabama, died November 28, 2021. Doyle Lee Ham was a death row inmate in Alabama. He was convicted and sentenced to death for killing Patrick Cunningham during a robbery in 1987. While on death row, Ham developed lymphatic cancer. This illness made it hard or impossible to find a vein to give the drugs used in lethal injections. Despite warnings from Ham's lawyer and human rights groups, and a legal battle lasting decades, the Alabama Department of Corrections tried to execute Ham on February 22, 2018. At 6 p.m. on that day, the Supreme Court issued a temporary stay of execution while it reviewed Ham's claims. Almost 3 hours later, around 8:40 p.m., the court lifted the stay and denied Ham's request to delay the execution. Justices Ginsburg and Sotomayor disagreed with the decision. They noted that Alabama's method to execute Ham despite his cancer and vein problems had never been tried before in the state. During the execution attempt, correctional officers spent 2.5 hours inserting needles into Ham's legs and ankles to find a vein. The team turned Ham onto his stomach and slapped the backs of his legs to help locate a usable vein. When this failed, they started inserting needles into his groin. During this process, they stabbed Ham about 6 times, puncturing his bladder and his femoral artery. In the days after the attempt, Ham's urine contained blood from the bladder injury. A large amount of blood was also collected around his groin during the execution, soaking the pad he lay on, forcing the team to replace it. This bleeding led people to believe the femoral artery had been punctured. When officials finally stopped the execution, Ham collapsed as they removed him from the gurney. The next day, his lawyer said Ham was limping, sore, and a shadow of himself. Ham became only the 4th person in the United States since 1946 to leave the execution chamber alive. Afterward, Jeff Dunn, commissioner of the Alabama Department of Corrections, told reporters, "I wouldn't necessarily characterize what we had tonight as a problem." The New York Times called the botched execution ghoulish proceedings. Sarah Totonchi, executive director of the Southern Center for Human Rights, called it unconscionable and said it showed the cruelty and the torture of the death penalty. A local Alabama newspaper called the attempt torture in Alabama's death chamber. A doctor who examined Ham after the attempt told the federal court that Ham wished for death during the execution because he preferred to die rather than to continue to experience the ongoing severe pain. On March 5, 2018, Ham and his lawyer filed an amended civil rights lawsuit against the Alabama Department of Corrections. The lawsuit claimed that a second execution attempt would violate Ham's rights under the 5th, 8th, and 14th Amendments. Ham also said that a second attempt would break a federal law called 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, which protects civil rights. Right after the first execution attempt, the Alabama Attorney General's office refused to say whether they would try to execute Ham again. On March 26, 2018, a month after the attempt, Ham and the state of Alabama reached a confidential settlement. The settlement ended all pending state and federal lawsuits and stopped Alabama from scheduling a second execution date for Ham. At a press conference announcing Oklahoma's plan to use inert gas inhalation for executions, Joe Albaugh, director of the Oklahoma Department of Corrections, called the attempt to execute Ham inhumane. Ham died in prison from cancer-related complications on November 28, 2021. If you enjoy the way we create videos and would like us to bring more cases like this to light, please hit the like button and subscribe for more in-depth dives.